bad news. Betty's dead.
What? What happened?
Shot. Apparently, the neighbors found her.
Oh my God.
Welcome back to the official Love and Death podcast. I'm Nancy Miller, and the fourth episode, it's called Do No Evil, but what happened was actually pretty evil. A violent incident so brutal, I feel like we've all earned a peppermint for being so brave. Don't you? So let's recap. At the start of this episode, we're witnessing an intense, "you can't have him, I don't want him" standoff between Candy Montgomery and Betty Gore. Two women, one axe, and an ominous tick-tock sound. Because life as we all know it here in Wiley, Texas, is about to implode. And in the end, it's Candy who goes off on Betty Gore. Exactly how it all played out, nobody really knows yet. That includes Candy herself, who appears to be in such deep denial of what she's done. She flees a grisly crime scene, goes back to church, watches a movie, has sex with her husband, all the while leaving behind a huge, horrific mess, which includes abandoning a toddler, left all alone in a house with her murdered mother. As the details of Betty's murder become impossible to ignore, Candy hones a breathlessly scripted alibi that the police and the townspeople of Wiley naively go along with, because there hasn't been a murder here in 25 years. As for us, the viewers, this murder also feels unreal. Candy Montgomery? This fun and sassy woman we've come to know, maybe even like? Out of nowhere, what she's done, it's unthinkable. And suddenly, our gothic prairie drama is now a tense thriller. And here to talk about this nail-biting pivot, our series writer and creator David E. Kelley, and executive producer and director Lesli Linka Glatter. Lesli Linka Glatter and David E. Kelley, welcome back to the companion podcast of Love and Death.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Glad to be back.
So here we are. You have built up relationships, terrifying tension, but finally in episode 4, there's a big tone shift in the series, where we basically are moving from a drama to a thriller. David, what went into this moment, into this pivot in the series?
The facts, really. We were just trying to be true to what really happened. And that was one of the things that drew us to the series to begin with. This was a different beast. Usually in a series or a limited series, you can have story twists, but you're offering the same episodes are the same but different. By the same, it's the same characters, the same tone, the same flow, but the story takes twists and turns. In this series, it really takes a much more pivotal shift and profound shift, because it's not just twists and turns with facts. It really becomes a much graver palette to tune into. And that's where the story took us. We always tried to let the story be the boss of not just what the characters said and did, but also the feel and tone of the show as well. And by the time we got to episode 4, this is tough stuff, and we were not going to pretend otherwise. So we let the story take us, and that's where we went.
I think one of the things that I loved and found the most challenging was the tonal shift. That in the beginning, yes, it's a drama, but it's also there are things that are funny in it. And it's very much about relationships. And here, the primary relationship becomes Betty and Candy. And if any number of things had gone differently that day, if Jenny and Alyssa decided not to have a sleepover, if she wasn't going to go to a swimming class, if they didn't sit down, I don't think Candy in any way went over there to kill Betty. I don't think Betty was going to ask Candy, "Did you have an affair with my husband?" I think it happened in the moment. And it was the tumbling of events that happened. And I can tell you for me as a director, I've shot a lot of action, but this was the most upsetting and horrible scene I've ever shot because it was up close and personal. It was two women. It was two characters we really cared about. It was two housewives. And we tried to be very clear. Again, remember, we're only hearing what happened from one person's point of view, from Candy's point of view, because she's the one who survived. But every detail of what was in that laundry room, we copied that from the police reports. So we become a police drama and a thriller now. And then in the last two episodes, we're a courtroom drama.
Yeah, well, yes. And I am thinking, wow, you've got David E. Kelley writing a courtroom drama. David writing one with Don Crowder. It must have been extraordinary to be able to have that opportunity for this lawyer character who's phenomenal. And we get to see him and meet him in episode 4 as Don Crowder's talking big in the church parking lot about what his theory is about the crime, but he's going to play a bigger role in Candy's life in subsequent episodes.
Yeah, we meet him. He is a member of the church. He has never tried a criminal case ever. He's wonderful in the parking lot, but now he's going to actually get the case. Candy wants to give him the case. And it's like, oh my God, what are you thinking? Candy, it's very simple. She wants to be with someone she trusts. She knows Don and she wants to trust him. So
right.
If it were fiction, you could probably knock us for trying to be a little too cutesy, but this was the truth.
I think one of the things with Candy's character, because we only see a little bit of the beginning of what goes on in that laundry room in 4, but you see Candy try to come back in herself and almost pretend that nothing happened. If I could only wish it away, I will be okay. It won't have happened. And that, to me, speaks to who Candy is. I mean, she went back to church, and she basically pretended like nothing happened. But it's all she could do because the fact of what had happened there, she could not face.
So we hear Candy tell a series of events over and over again. I went to her house, then I went to Target, my watch stopped, et cetera, et cetera.
Candy. Oh, Barbara. I went to Betty's, and we just got to talking, and I looked at my watch and thought enough time to go to Target to get Father's Day cards, so I drove all the way to Plano. But when I got to the parking lot, I realized my watch had stopped, and so I was late. I didn't even go in. I'm so upset. I wanted to see the kids' puppet show.
Oh, and Jenny was just asking about you.
Well, I just am gonna have to make it up to them.
Candy, where have you been?
I'm so upset. I went to Betty's, and we just got to talking, and I thought I had enough time to go get Father's Day cards at Target, but when I got there, I realized my watch had stopped and that I was late.
And feel free to speculate as creators here, but I couldn't decide if my impression was, oh, Candy's just getting it straight, and it's an alibi. She's trying to establish an alibi, or is she master planning the way that she is putting this together?
I don't think she was.
Yeah,
I don't think she was master planning. I think she was trying to wish that it didn't happen. Mm-hmm. I wish that that's what happened. I went there. I was late. I couldn't get the cards. I was like, if only that had happened, I could go back to my normal life, and everything would be okay again. Do you agree, David? Because that's what I feel was happening.
Yes, I think that she was in a version of a dissociative state at that moment, a flight or fight. Her limbic system was probably in spasm, and she kind of went autopilot, which is why she kept repeating the same phrase over and over and over again, almost like she was trying to ingrain it upon herself as well as those who are listening to her, because if she could will it, if she could believe it, something about her could make what was true be untrue. And I believe as Candy continued to navigate her her way through life, she knew that she had picked up that axe, but she refused to believe that that was her. That was someone else that came out in that moment. And she was, as a matter of self-defense, determined to dissociate herself from that moment in the laundry room.
Well, to the degree that when she hears from Alan that Betty's been shot, she believes it almost. Like, whew.
But then you get into the whole police procedural.
Yes.
And, no one in that community had ever dealt with a murder. So the amount of evidence that was destroyed, I mean, the neighbors came in and basically cleaned up, and they stayed there, they made coffee, like they destroyed evidence. And then the wily police came in and they all were like hanging out in the house, tracking through, that house. She did not go in, commit a crime and try to clean up after herself. Like she took a shower in the master bathroom. I mean, not the master, the guest bathroom. And then the county police came and they tracked through the crime scene.
Right.
So what would have been like a slam dunk case became complicated because of the bad police work.
Even so, there seems to be this total resistance to believing that it might be Candy. It could be. It's a cult deal, the chief says. I'm sure you had to consider some of this, especially in the writing process, David, of thinking about how you look at a case like Candy's and how it wasn't immediately like, well, she was the last person there. She did it.
I was never putting myself into the shoes of the people and saying, well, what would you do? What should you do? I was really focused on what did they do? The police were definitely a bit incompetent at the beginning. The scene was well contaminated, and it did take them a bit to tumble to Candy, but not all that long because Alan drew them the roadmap. She was the last one there. Alan didn't suspect her at the time, but he provided the first clue. So I think the police did get to the truth fairly efficiently, but that original crime scene was a bit chaotic. Let's call it.
I think, the idea that the crime was so horrifying that I think in the beginning they couldn't imagine it would have been a woman. And then, of course, it became clear from the footprint that they found. But, the first thing the captain says, the police chief, is that it was probably a stranger passing through. And a drifter.
I love the word drifter.
It couldn't possibly be someone from inside our community.
Correct.
That's right. And so they use words like evil, it's a drifter, a deviant, an outsider.
An outsider.
Which brings us to the final scene of episode 4. David, you mentioned, Alan gives the first clue, and he's lying in bed, and here's a guy who looks like he's got a guilty conscience, and he makes a phone call. And he calls the police chief to reveal that he has actually had an affair with Candy.
Hello.
Chief Abbott, it is Alan Gore calling. I'm sorry to disturb you. I was just calling to let you know that there was one thing I was not truthful about.
Oh, what's that, Alan?
I did have an affair.
Oh.
With Candy Montgomery.
And I thought initially when I watched it the first time, oh, the poor guy's got a guilty conscience. He had an affair. And then I thought, wait a second. He probably knows he might be a suspect. And it might be time for him to drop the dime on Candy. This is obviously created by you two masterminds of having us understand the series. So how do you want us to think as we watch this?
My interpretation from reading the book, that he was driven more by guilt than he was a feeling that Candy had done it, that he had lied to the police and he wasn't comfortable with that and he wanted to correct that lie. But he had not yet arrived at the idea that Candy was the killer. It's possible he was entertaining that possibility, but that phone call to the police was more motivated by his sense of guilt.
I totally agree. I don't think it's because he wanted to throw the police off of him. I think he is not a liar, even though he had an affair and obviously was lying or not telling the truth. I think he found a way to compartmentalize. But when asked, there's a scene in episode 3 where he talks to Candy about Betty and Alan going to Marriage Encounter and how it was amazing and that they were incredibly honest with each other for the first time. And Candy says something, well, how honest could you be, Alan? And he says, well, they never said you can't see other people at Marriage Encounter. Like, how can you say that? Like, how could that come out of your mouth? But I think he also had a way, I don't think he ever lied. Like, I don't think he ever said out loud that he was having an affair. If you didn't say it, it was okay. So I think the fact that I totally agree with David, that to the police, he was asked and he lied.
One of the reasons why this case endures, and I'd love to hear your opinion as we sort of close out episode 4, is understanding why. Who is Candy? I mean, there are people who find themselves in horrible circumstances and do horrific things all the time. But why does an incident from, 40 years ago still compel us and interest us and rivet us to follow a series like this?
It's a question that has never been answered, so it continues to haunt us. Who is Candy? She's clearly complicated and has a multitude of pathologies, but I think that the goodness inside her, juxtaposed with the depravity of the act that she committed, is still very hard to fathom. And that's probably a reason that people are drawn to it 40 years later, because the question of who she is and what she was continues to be so compelling.
I think that's so well said. I think we don't quite know who she is. And that's what keeps this story so compelling and why you want to keep exploring it, is who is she? Is she a psychopath? Well, I don't think so. I kind of love her. We don't want to glorify her or vilify her. Who is she deep down? That is fascinating. And I don't know if there's an answer to that.
Yeah, there are there's a whole slew of true crime, fascinating stories.
Yeah.
We can pretty much size up the evil in those people and put them in that evil bucket and leave them there. Candy, you can't do that. Candy is, she committed an evil act, but she's a much more complicated and dimensional person than that. She was a family person who was full of a lot of emotions and attributes that we all aspire to, and that's what drew us, I think, to the piece to begin with. We recognized her. We knew a version of her. We grew up in neighborhoods where we were in kitchens with mothers like her.
Exactly.
There was something very familiar about Candy Montgomery. So it compounded our sense of horror that she could take the turn that she did and commit the act that she did.
We are in episode 4.
Yes.
There are many twists and turns to come in the Candy Montgomery story.
Yes.
And I think people will be on the edge of their seat. So thank you so much, Leslie. Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate your time, and it's been great having you on the podcast.
Thanks
Thank
so
you
much, Nancy.
Thank you.
David, great to see you.
Nice to see you again.
Thanks again to David E. Kelley and Lesli Linka Glatter for so brilliantly taking our moral compass and giving it a nice big spin. You, like me, might be having some conflicted feelings right now about Candy. Horror makes sense, but compassion? How? For this episode's Only in Texas, we've brought back Skip Hollandsworth as executive editor at Texas Monthly and one of the best crime writers of all time. He's covered some of Texas's most notorious murder cases. Here, Skip explains how he finds humanity in gruesome crime stories such as this. Skip, welcome back to the podcast. Let's talk about how a journalist approaches a subject like Candy Montgomery. We just finished episode 4, where we saw Candy commit an extremely violent act against her friend Betty. How do you look at a character like that, objectively, even sympathetically, and write their story?
If you don't try to understand your killer, if you don't try to get inside the killer's life and feel something for why that person made this kind of turn in his or her life, then your story's going to fail. Mm-hmm. You've got to be able to make your audience feel as much sympathy for the killer as for the victim. Or maybe the better way to say it is you've got to make the reader understand the killer.
Yes.
Or else your story will fail. You've got to get them interested in why the killer did what he or she did, or you're going to lose.
So we're in an era now where we're looking at victims and survivors differently, and people are working actively to help tell stories from the perspective of the families. So it's not just someone who was killed. There was a person at one point who had a life. How do you dig into a dark story like the Candy Montgomery story? We're looking at the lives of the people who were deeply affected, the victims and the families. How do you do that and still honor and respect the subjects involved?
Well, you have to use what I call FaceTime. You can't call them up. You need to show up at their door, and you need to say things like, I'm writing this story and I need help. I need to understand why this happened. And is there a chance you could let me in just to say hello and to understand that I'm not writing another trashy tabloidish story about what your family's been through? They still might shut the door on you. But people want to tell their stories of what they have endured and what loss they've struggled to deal with. And people want to tell the story. People want to talk about their best friend.
Yeah.
Who turned into a monster and why. And you want to, and they're looking for someone to tell that story to. And what we try to do at Texas Monthly is to be there, is to have FaceTime, is to say we're willing to spend as much time as you want to give us to tell the story. What kind of silverware y'all use at dinner?
Yes.
What does the backyard swimming pool look like? Where do you buy all your white shirts, Alan Gore, that you wear to the office? You know, it's those kind of little details that people begin to relate to and understand the characters you're writing about.
Something that I think Texas Monthly really does well is establishing that perfect long-form narrative, which lends itself ideally to a 7-episode television series. So, Skip, how crucial it is for you to sort of set the scene of understanding the town of Wiley, understanding that surrounding area, and giving those of us who've never set foot in Texas a good sense of place.
Well, if you don't write about what the streets look like, what the neighborhood looks like, the setting of a town, then it could feel like any other town in America. And, you know, we do sometimes write a setting before we even get to the characters. Mm-hmm. I mean, Mimi Schwartz wrote one of our most famous true crime pieces about a mother in the town of Channelview who was so upset that her daughter had lost out in a cheerleading competition to another mother's daughter that she hired a country trailer park hitman to kill the mother.
Ah, that's a great piece.
Mimi spent weeks shaping the initial setting of Channelview, how a working class blue collar town operates. And so you're sort of fascinated by the town itself before she even brings in the characters who are beyond belief.
You know, in television these days, you can do a drone shot and you get a really good sense of a town, but it comes down to understanding the people and the geography and the day-to-day that makes a rich scene.
And it makes Texas more complicated than a lot of outsiders tend to make it. You know, Wiley seems like just another small town or a small suburb, but it's full of complicated people, and thus complications arise. It's not people that just answer their phone wearing a Bible buckle belt and saying yellow instead of hello. It's a real place.
Candy has to drive to 5 different towns to get 5 things done, or sometimes to get 1 thing done. If she wants to pick up her kid to go to the school, if she wants to get the Father's Day card at Target, if she wants to go and then drop something off at Betty Gore's place, she's in the car all day long hitting these 5 different points from church and back. And that's kind of a motif, I guess, that's played with in the series, where you see her driving around in her car, listening to the radio, listening to the pop hits of the 70s and 80s, and just kind of like how much of a maze or how inane that must feel like. Maybe that's what starts to drive Candy a little crazy.
And women who watch this series, who live a sort of similar life where they drive around all day taking care of their kids or shopping or running errands or doing this kind of domesticated life that they feel like they've been pushed into, they will understand that same feeling Candy Montgomery has.
I mean, you raise a really good point. I think we tend to think of some of these true crime stories that happened 30, 40 years ago with this sepia tone that it's far in the past. But if I understand what you're saying correctly, Candy's life is just as much in the present, potentially, as it was in 1979 and 1980.
You got it.
I'm not sure how I feel about that.
Run for your life. Go live in the hills.
I live in LA. I'm in my car all the time, and I'm really rethinking my life choices. Thank you so much, Skip Hollandsworth, for coming back to the Love and Death podcast.
I enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for joining us for the latest episode of the podcast. We'll see you next Thursday for episode 5, where we will unpack the character of Candy's loyal husband, Pat Montgomery, and his short shorts, with actor Patrick Fugit. Plus, a dive into the late 70s, early 80s Texas fashion and culture, and how over-the-top Texas style took over the whole world. The official Love and Death podcast is an HBO Max production in partnership with Texas Monthly Studio, the in-house agency for Texas Monthly. Our executive producers are Maddie Builder and Aaron Kubatsky. The podcast is written, produced, and hosted by me, Nancy Miller. Brian Standifer is our audio engineer, editor, and mixer. Music is courtesy of Warner Media, HBO Max, and Brian Standifer. Watch Love and Death now on HBO Max.